시작합니다.
Title: At an Apple Farm. Chapter 1: A New Friend. Mary loved her family's apple farm. She spent her days helping her mother. One sunny afternoon, she noticed a boy. He is the same age as Mary, and has curly hair. He was new and looked lost. Mary waved at him with a smile. "Hi, I'm Mary. What's your name?" The boy smiled shyly and said, "I'm Hans. I'm from the city." Mary's eyes grew wide with curiosity. She had never met a city boy. "What's it like in the city?" Mary asked. Hans thought for a moment and said, "It's loud, busy, and full of people." Mary giggled and said, "That sounds fun." Hans looked at the wide open fields. "It's so peaceful here," Hans said quietly. Mary picked an apple from a tree. "Here, try this. It's sweet," she said. Hans took a bite and grinned happily. "This is the best apple ever," Hans said. Mary felt proud of her family's apples. "Do you like it here so far?" she asked. Hans nodded, looking at the green fields. "It's so different from the city," he said. Mary showed him around the apple farm. "This is where I play every day," she said. Hans was amazed by the open space. "Can we run through the fields?" Hans asked. Mary smiled and said, "Let's go." They ran together, laughing and smiling. Hans had never felt so free before. Mary was glad to have a new friend. She hoped they would have many adventures. And so, their friendship began that day. From then on, they played every afternoon. They both knew this summer would be special. Chapter 2: Exploring the Fields. The next morning, Hans woke up early. He was excited to meet Mary again. They had planned to explore the farm. "Let's go see the farthest field," Mary said. Hans followed her, eager for more adventure. As they walked, Mary pointed at the animals. "Those are our cows. They give milk," she said. Hans laughed as a cow mooed loudly. "I've never seen a cow up close," he said. Mary smiled, proud of her farm life. They walked through the apple trees together. "This is my favorite an apple tree," Mary said. She patted the trunk like an old friend. Hans looked up at the high branches. "It's so big. How old is it?" Hans asked. Mary thought for a second and said, "My mom says it's over 30 years old." Hans was amazed by the tree's age. "It's older than both of us," he said. They climbed a small hill behind the farm. From the top, they could see everything. "Look, the farm looks tiny from here," Hans said. Mary nodded and sat down in the grass. "This is where I come to think," she said. Hans lay down next to her and sighed. "It's so quiet and peaceful here," he said. Mary handed him a flower from the ground. "Here, it's for you," she said kindly. Hans took the flower and smiled brightly. "Thanks, Mary. You're a really good friend," Hans said. Mary felt happy and proud at his words. They watched the clouds drift across the sky. Hans turned to Mary and asked, "Do you think we'll always be friends?" Mary nodded seriously and said, "Of course. I'll never forget you." The two promised to remain friends forever. Even if they lived in different places, their hearts would always be connected. Chapter 3: Hard Work Together. One afternoon, Mary's mother needed help. The apples were ready to be harvested. "We need to pick all the ripe apples," Mary's mother explained with a gentle smile. Mary and Hans decided to help out. They grabbed baskets and went to work. "This is a lot of apples," Hans said. Mary laughed and handed him more baskets. "It's a big job, but we can do it," she said. Hans had never worked on a farm before. He wasn't used to the hard labor. "This is harder than I thought," Hans admitted. Mary smiled and said, "It's not so bad. It's fun when you work with friends." Hans wiped his brow and smiled back. "You're right. It's kind of fun," he said. The sun was hot, but they didn't stop. They worked together, picking apples carefully. Hans climbed a ladder to reach the top. Look, I'm getting the highest apples, he said. Mary cheered him on from below. You're doing great, Hans, she called. After hours of hard work, they were done. Mary's mother brought them cold lemonade. You both did an amazing job today, said Mary's mother. Mary and Hans drank their lemonade happily. I've never worked so hard before, Hans said. But it feels good to help, he added. Mary nodded and said, That's farm life. We all help each other. Hans felt proud to be part of it. He knew he was becoming stronger. And he knew he and Mary made a great team. Chapter 4: The Big Storm. One night, a huge storm came suddenly. The wind howled and rain poured down heavily. Mary woke up to the sound of thunder. She jumped out of bed, worried about the farm. She knew the apple trees might be in danger. Mary ran outside with her mother. The rain was cold, and the wind was fierce. Just then, Hans appeared, running through the rain. I'm here to help, Hans shouted over the wind. Mary smiled at him, feeling braver now. The trees need to be protected, she shouted. Hans grabbed some rope to tie the branches. Mary held onto the smaller trees, keeping them safe. Her mother covered the plants with tarps. The storm raged on, but they didn't stop. We have to save the trees, Hans yelled. Mary's heart was pounding, but she didn't give up. Hans worked beside her, never complaining. The wind blew harder, but they held on tight. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the storm started to calm down. The rain stopped, and the wind died down. Mary, Hans, and her mother stood exhausted. But the trees were safe, thanks to their teamwork. We did it, Mary said, feeling relieved. Hans grinned, his face wet from the rain. We saved the farm together, he said proudly. Mary's mother hugged them both tightly. You two are my heroes, she said warmly. Mary felt proud to have Hans by her side. Together, they could face anything, even storms. Chapter 5: A Surprise from Hans. A few days after the storm, Hans had a special surprise for Mary. "I've been working on something for you," he said. Mary looked curious and asked, "What is it?" Hans smiled and pulled something from his pocket. It was a small wooden bird, carefully carved. "I made it myself," Hans said proudly. Mary gasped with delight when she saw it. "It's beautiful. You made this for me?" she asked. Hans nodded and handed the bird to her. "I wanted to give you something special," he said. Mary held the bird carefully, admiring the details. "This is the best gift ever," she said warmly. Hans smiled, happy that she liked it. "I thought it would remind you of me," Hans said. Mary looked at the bird and smiled. "What is the M and H written here?" asks Mary. "That's an abbreviation for Mary and Hans," Hans replies. Mary was so moved by this gift that she was about to cry. "I'll treasure it forever," she promised. Hans felt proud of his hard work. He knew the bird would always remind Mary of their friendship and the time they spent together. Mary put the bird on her windowsill. Every day, she would look at it and smile. Hans knew their friendship would last forever. Chapter 6: Saying Goodbye. As summer came to an end, Hans had to return to the city. "I don't want to leave," Hans said sadly. Mary felt her heart sink at his words. "I don't want you to go either," she said. They sat under their favorite apple tree. For a while, neither of them spoke. They both knew this moment would come. But it didn't make it any easier. "I'll miss you, Hans," Mary said softly. Hans looked down at the ground and nodded. "I'll miss you too, Mary," he said quietly. They spent their last day together. They ran through the fields one last time. They climbed the hill and watched the sunset. "Promise me we'll always be friends," Mary said. Hans looked into her eyes and promised. "No matter where we are, we'll be friends," said Hans. They held hands, not wanting to let go. As Hans prepared to leave, Mary gave him a small apple. "Take this with you. It's from my favorite tree," she said. Hans smiled and tucked the apple in his bag. Thank you, Mary. I'll always remember this summer, he said with a soft smile. They hugged tightly, their hearts heavy with goodbye.
구독과 좋아요 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.